Let's talk more about the president, the Russia investigation, and more. Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger is joining us. He's a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman, thanks so much for joining us.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
How important perspective is it that Robert Mueller interviewed the president as far as the Russia probe investigation is concerned?
Well, how important it's up to Robert Mueller. As I've said from the beginning, America just wants answers. This is the best route to get answers to what happened and hold anybody that fell short of the law or violated the law, hold them accountable to what that is. And if Robert Mueller believes he needs to interview the president, then I believe the president's team will set up the proper way to do that. Ultimately, people just want answers. They want to know what happened. They want to know what's going on. And to the extent the president to the investigatory team can provide that information, I'm sure they're all going to work together to get to that answer.
And you're a Republican. You have confidence in Mueller, right?
I do, yeah.
How much influence should the president's legal team, his lawyers, have in deciding the scope, the format of this kind of interview?
Well, that's hard for me to answer as a not lawyer, thankfully. But as a not lawyer, it's hard for me to answer that. So I look at it and go, okay, well, so they have some questions that they want answered, whatever those questions are. The president's team needs to work with them to make sure at the end of the day those questions are answered. But I do think it's legitimate, and I think it's proper for the president's team to say, we don't want to just have an open-ended fishing expedition here. We all remember the optics from President Clinton when he was under this investigation and some of that stuff that kind of happened. And everybody would agree that some of those optics weren't good for anybody, much less the country. And so I think setting this up and doing this the right way is proper, totally expected. And I think anybody else, whether president or not, in his position would be engaging in the same way.
Yeah, Bill Clinton spent 4 hours testifying with a video hookup to a grand jury when he was questioned about the Monica Lewinsky affair. It's a lot of us who covered the Clinton administration remember. In your perspective, is this a sign, a potential interview between Robert Mueller and the president, a sign that Mueller may be completing or nearing an end of his investigation?
It's total speculation on my part, but if I was to speculate, I would say that, yeah, if he interviews the president, that's probably the last person that would be on the list of very important folks to talk to. And I don't think necessarily this investigation is going to wrap up anytime soon, but I think that's basically the end of the information gathering stage. And from there, then, you go into processing that information. But having never served on a special counsel, and again, not being an expert in being a lawyer, it's kind of hard for me to tell.
You were a U.S. Air Force pilot as opposed to being a lawyer, so you got a different kind of training. The New York Times, as you know, Congressman, has reported details on Don McGahn, the White House counsel, how he lobbied the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, against recusal, how Sessions was looking to put out damaging information on the FBI Director Comey, the Justice Department denying that. Do you think that those men need to be investigated?
Do they need to be investigated for that? Not necessarily. Again, I don't know what's legally proper in this case or what isn't. I have heard a lot of experts, though, on various shows talking about this meeting and saying, look, it's actually proper for the president's lawyer to go out and say, hey, here's a concern. The president, we all need to keep this in mind. And I want an independent investigation free of influence from the executive branch. But we have to keep in mind the president does have oversight of the judiciary and of the, not of the judiciary, but of justice. And so for, I think, the lawyer to go and say, hey, here's a concern or here's an interest, we don't want you to recuse yourself, is not necessarily improper. If it is, that should be held accountable. But from what I've heard, there's not a lot of people that say, because when it became obvious that the Attorney General was going to recuse himself, he did back away.
Axios is reporting that President Trump's schedule has shifted to include less meetings, more what they call executive times. Axios is told that involves more time to watch TV, more time to tweet from the residents over at the White House. The White House totally denying that. But what's your analysis? Are you concerned about this report in Axios?
I'm not a fan of the president's Twitter. Let's be clear about that. I've said that. But I think to say executive time automatically means he's sitting on the couch watching news and doing nothing else but obsessing over it. Look, I've met with the president 3 different occasions in the White House. And I'll tell you, he's somebody that knows his issues. He's engaged. This isn't political spin. This isn't me as a Republican standing up and saying Republican stuff. This is what I've experienced. A president that knows the issues in North Korea. He knows the issues in Asia. I specifically met with him right before his Asia trip. And so executive time, I mean, look, as a congressman, sometimes I'm in my office, and that's where I make my calls. That's where I catch up on news of the day. Because otherwise, at the end of the day, it's 7, 8 o'clock at night, and you realize all you've done is meet. You had meetings, but you never actually accomplished anything. So that's where some of that comes into effect. So I don't think it's a scandal or anything really necessarily improper. Now, I think if the president is glued to the TV for 3 hours, that's probably a habit he ought to break. But there's no doubt he watches TV. But I think he makes phone calls and does a lot of his other stuff, which is important for a president to do.
The president went in front of the cameras over the weekend at Camp David, strongly defended himself against these new questions that have emerged about his mental state, questions emerging from that new bombshell book. All the leaders of the party were behind him, members of the cabinet, members of the Republican leadership in the House and Senate. What message does that send?
So I didn't like the tweets. Again, you know, sending out the tweet talking about yourself and your mental acuity, I always think is not, you know, look, as a president, I think there are some things you just need to be bigger than. But at the same time, there's something much bigger at play here, which is it is very dangerous to question the mental acuity of the President of the United States, which the other side of the aisle is doing a lot more of, and it's actually starting to really concern me. I remember with President Ronald Reagan, there were a lot of people questioning his sanity and questioning, you know, his mental acuity. With President George W. Bush, people were questioning him and saying he's not up to the job because he's not intelligent. There's this pattern of questioning the mental ability of presidents of the United States that happen to be Republican. Look, I think President Trump is not insane. I think he's not psycho. I think he's different than what people expect. But to go to that next level, as some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are doing and saying he's mentally incompetent to be president of the United States is way more dangerous than what they accuse any of his tweets on North Korea of doing. It tells our enemies overseas that they have somebody that that isn't necessarily all there, and that's wrong, and I fully, frankly, disagree with that assertion.
Congressman, stand by. There are other developments I want to raise with you, discuss with you. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Let's get back to Congressman Kinzinger. Congressman, can you avert a government shutdown?
I certainly hope so. I think this is going to be really the showdown point. You know, we came up to Christmas and we passed a CR. I expected that. I think this is really going to be the inflection point where we get some things done or we don't. And look, you know, I may be one of the younger guys out here, but I'm actually kind of an old school believer that both sides have got to find ways to come together and get some stuff fixed. And right now it seems like people are just in their corners. You know, everybody interprets news based on how they want to see it. Everybody believes somebody's right or wrong based on what they want to see. This is a situation, I think this one is actually pretty easily solvable. The reality is nobody except some of the most kind of fringe elements really want to deport 1 million people that know nothing besides this country as their home. But at the same time, I think it's unrealistic to say we're going to do that without some aspect of border security, whether it's a wall or whether it's a wall in some places with some technology in other areas. How you can be against border security, I don't know. So these are both two things that I think the vast majority of people want. We just out in Washington, D.C. have to learn to get to yes sometimes. And that's, you know, that's to Republicans and to Democrats. We can solve this if we want to.
But the president says there's not going to be a deal to let those dreamers stay unless there is the money for the wall. He says down the road, maybe at some point, Mexico will pay for it in some form. But he's asking for $18 billion right now to build that long wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. Otherwise, those dreamers are not going to be allowed to stay. What say you?
Well, and Nancy Pelosi says she's not going to have any kind of a deal without DACA. So we have two things. The president wants $18 billion for border security. Nancy Pelosi wants DACA. It seems like we can take both those things and marry them together and say, all right, we're going to do the DACA thing. The president has said that he wants to solve the DACA issue. But also it's unrealistic to say that the president doesn't have a right to ask for some of what he promised in a campaign, which is enough for border security. And again, the vast majority of people would say secure the border. And it's not about immigration. It's as much about drugs as anything. This seems imminently solvable, but in Washington, D.C., we make everything so complicated every day.
How concerned are you, if you are concerned, that this $18 billion to build a wall that U.S. taxpayers would have to pay for, that could impact the nation's deficit?
I'm always concerned. I mean, we find ourselves in $20 trillion of debt, so we're going to have to spend money as a country, but anytime we spend money, we add to debt, which is why we need to continue to have big discussions about how do we continue to grow the economy to increase revenues, how do we make sure we're helping people get from poverty to work and achieve their full God-given potential. These are the kind of things that I hope in 2018 we can begin to have that conversation, understanding the elections on the horizon. We're probably not going to make huge efforts, but on a long term as a country, these are discussions we need to be able to get out of our corners and have as Americans and not just Republicans and Democrats.
Why should Americans have to pay for the wall, Congressman, when President Trump ran on the promise, he guaranteed it so many times that Mexico would pay for it?
Yeah, I can't speak for the president on that one. I always thought from the beginning that's a pretty tough nut to crack to get the Mexicans to pay for the wall. But at the same time, look, the president has talked about border security. There is a law in place that says the border has to be secure, of which many Democrats that are now against this have voted for. This is a situation, again, we can solve this. Everybody out needs to take a deep breath. We need to put our identities as Republican and Democrats aside for a little bit and try to call ourselves American with political bias first, and we can achieve some really big things if we want.
Congressman Kinzinger, thanks so much.